In the spring of 1968, in the working-class district of Scotswood in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, something happened that would force an entire nation to confront an uncomfortable truth, that evil does not always announce itself with a deep voice and a weathered face. Sometimes, it arrives with pigtails and a child's innocent smile. Sometimes, the monster hiding in plain sight is barely tall enough to reach the doorknob. This is the story of Mary Bell, a name that still echoes through the corridors of criminal psychology, whispered in university lecture halls, and studied in forensic textbooks. An 11-year-old girl who did something so incomprehensible that, even today, experts struggle to fully understand it. But to understand Mary Bell, we must first understand the world she came from. A world where childhood was not the protected sanctuary we imagined it to be, where darkness could take root in the smallest of hearts. Before we begin, I must warn you, this is not a story with easy answers. It is not a tale where good triumphs over evil in neat, satisfying ways. It is something far more disturbing, a glimpse into the abyss of human nature, into questions we would rather not ask about innocence, culpability, and the very nature of evil itself. The question that will haunt us throughout this narrative is not simply what happened in Scotswood in 1968, but how it was possible at all. And more troubling still, could we have seen it coming? Scotswood in the late 1960s was not the sort of place that appeared in tourist brochures. It was a neighborhood of cramped terraced houses, narrow streets, and industrial grime that settled on everything like a second skin. The men worked in shipyards and factories when work was available. The women made miracles stretch meager budgets. Children played in the streets because there was nowhere else to go, concrete playgrounds echoing with shouts and laughter, where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of community where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors watched each other's children, where life was hard but predictable. People looked out for one another, or so they believed. In this tightly knit world lived Mary Flora Bell, born in 1957 to a mother named Betty, a woman whose occupation was delicately referred to in polite company as an escort. The truth was less polite. Betty Bell worked as a prostitute, often bringing clients into the home she shared with her daughter. Mary's father was absent, a question mark that would never be satisfactorily answered. Some said he was a career criminal. Others whispered darker possibilities that we won't explore here, but that planted the first seeds of Mary's troubled psychology. From the outside, Mary appeared to be just another child in Scotswood. She had striking bright eyes that seemed almost too intelligent, too knowing for someone so young. Neighbors would later recall those eyes, how they seemed to look through you rather than at you. But at the time, she was simply Betty Bell's daughter, playing in the streets with the other children, going to school, living what appeared to be an ordinary life. But there were signs, small things that, in retrospect, form a pattern that no one quite saw until it was too late. When Mary was 3 years old, she ingested a large quantity of pills and had to be rushed to the hospital. It was ruled an accident. When she was 4, the same thing happened again. Another accident, surely. But by the time a third incident occurred, some began to wonder, were these really accidents? Or was someone deliberately harming this child? Mary's mother Betty would later claim she had tried to kill her daughter multiple times, though she said this with such casual indifference that investigators couldn't determine if it was true, if it was an attention-seeking fabrication, or something more complex. What was clear was that Mary Bell's childhood was not the innocent time of wonder and protection that childhood should be. It was something else entirely, a battlefield where survival required adaptation, where emotions became weapons, where a child learned lessons no child should ever learn. The other children in Scotswood noticed that Mary was different. She could be charming, almost hypnotically so, drawing other children into her orbit. But there was something unsettling beneath that charm. She had a quick temper that could flare into violence. She told elaborate lies with such conviction that you almost believed them. She seemed to lack something that other children had: a break, a conscience, an understanding of boundaries. Teachers at her school noted behavioral problems. She was intelligent, perhaps too intelligent, but she seemed to use her intelligence in disturbing ways, manipulating other children, creating conflicts, watching the results with a detached curiosity that made adults uncomfortable. But these were the 1960s, and the understanding of child psychology was primitive compared to today. Difficult children were simply that, difficult. The idea that an 11-year-old girl could be genuinely dangerous seemed absurd. And then came May 1968. And everything changed. The day was May 25, 1968. A Saturday. The weather was pleasant, one of those rare days when the industrial haze lifted enough to see blue sky. Children were everywhere in Scotswood, playing their eternal games, their voices carrying through the narrow streets. In a derelict house on St. Margaret's Road, one of those abandoned buildings that dotted the neighborhood, places children were constantly warned to avoid but constantly explored anyway, a 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown was playing. Or he had been playing. His body was discovered around 3:30 in the afternoon by 3 boys who had wandered into the abandoned structure. The scene was puzzling. Martin lay on the floor, seemingly asleep, but something was wrong. There was blood and saliva around his mouth. The boys ran for help, their shouts bringing neighbors and, eventually, the police. The initial investigation was confused. There were no obvious signs of violence, no clear evidence of foul play. The pathologist who examined Martin's body concluded that he had likely died from accidentally ingesting something toxic, perhaps tablets or pills found in the derelict building. It was a tragedy, certainly, a terrible reminder of why children should stay out of dangerous abandoned structures. But it was ruled an accident. The neighborhood mourned. The Brown family was devastated. And Mary Bell attended the wake. This detail would later take on sinister significance, but at the time, no one thought much of it. Children often attended such gatherings, not fully understanding the gravity of death. But witnesses would later recall how Mary behaved at the wake. She seemed excited rather than somber. She asked to see Martin's body, saying she wanted to see him in his coffin. When Martin's mother, June Brown, broke down in tears, Mary smiled. It was an off-putting moment, but grief affects people in strange ways, and children especially don't always understand appropriate behavior. June Brown would later recall feeling deeply uncomfortable around Mary, sensing something fundamentally wrong, but at the time, she couldn't articulate why. It was just a feeling, a mother's instinct that something about this child was not right. The day after Martin's death, investigators received a strange break-in report. Someone had entered a nearby nursery school and vandalized it. Notes were found, disturbing notes written in a child's handwriting. One read, "I murder so that I may come back." Another was even more chilling. "We did murder Martin Brown." The police were baffled. The notes seemed like a prank, the work of children who had heard about Martin's death and were playing a macabre game. The handwriting was analyzed, but this was 1968. Forensic analysis was rudimentary. The notes were filed away as the work of troubled youth, nothing more. But the notes were not a prank. They were a confession. And they were a warning of what was to come. In the weeks that followed Martin Brown's death, Mary Bell's behavior became increasingly erratic. She approached June Brown on the street one day and asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, "Do you miss Martin?" When June, barely holding herself together, said yes, Mary replied, "I know he's dead. I wanted to see him in his coffin, but you wouldn't let me, would you?" The conversation left June Brown shaken. But what could she do? Report an 11-year-old girl for being strange? For asking uncomfortable questions? In the grief-stricken fog she was living in, it was just another painful moment in a succession of painful moments. Mary's teachers noticed changes too. She seemed distracted in class, her mind elsewhere. When other children played, she watched them with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. She began spending more time with a 13-year-old named Norma Bell, no relation, despite the shared surname. Norma was slightly slow intellectually, easily led, eager to please. In Mary, she had found someone who paid attention to her, who included her in secret adventures. What those adventures were, Norma would later struggle to fully explain. Mary had a way of making wrong things seem exciting, of framing disturbing games as thrilling secrets. And Norma, desperate for friendship, followed where Mary led. The police investigation into Martin Brown's death had essentially concluded. The accidental death verdict stood. The neighborhood was beginning to heal, to return to its normal rhythms. Summer was approaching. Children were excited for school to end. And then, on July 31st, 1968, another child went missing. Brian Howe was 3 years old, with the chubby cheeks and innocent eyes that define early childhood. On that July afternoon, he was playing near his home when he wandered off, as 3-year-olds sometimes do, drawn by some momentary curiosity, some imagined adventure. When he didn't return for dinner, his family began to worry. Neighbors were alerted. A search began. In Scotswood, everyone knew everyone's children. A missing 3-year-old was everyone's emergency. As darkness fell, the search intensified. Police were called. Flashlights swept through alleys and abandoned buildings. Shouts of Brian's name echoed through the streets. The next morning, Brian's body was found in a patch of wasteland between 2 blocks of houses. But this time, there was no possibility of ruling it an accident. Brian Howe had been strangled. His body showed signs of a violent struggle, scratches, bruises. But there was more, details so disturbing that police initially withheld them from the public. Someone had mutilated the child's body post-mortem. Scissors had been used to cut the hair, to puncture the skin. An attempt had been made to carve a letter, perhaps an M, though it was crude and unclear, into the child's stomach. The neighborhood that had barely recovered from Martin Brown's death was now gripped by panic. There was a killer in Scotswood, and judging by the nature of the crime, by the combination of violence and grotesque curiosity it displayed, the killer was deeply disturbed. The police investigation was massive. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. Every resident of Scotswood was considered a potential witness or suspect. The profile they were working with was of a mentally ill adult, likely male, someone with a history of violence or sexual deviance. This was the framework within which they understood such crimes. But there was a problem with their investigation. Witnesses kept mentioning 2 girls who had been seen near the wasteland around the time Brian disappeared. 2 young girls, one about 11, one about 13. The descriptions were vague. Children playing, nothing unusual. Several witnesses reported seeing Mary Bell and Norma Bell in the area. The police interviewed both girls, but it was perfunctory. They were children. They were asked if they had seen anything suspicious, if they had noticed any strange adults in the area. Both girls said no. Mary, in particular, was composed and helpful, offering detailed descriptions of other people she had supposedly seen, none of which led anywhere. It was Norma who first began to crack. In the days after Brian's murder, Norma's behavior became increasingly agitated. She told different people different versions of what she had seen. She claimed to have information about the murder. When detectives interviewed her more seriously, she began to make strange statements, circling around admissions, but never quite making them. And then she said something that changed everything. "Mary did it." The detective interviewing her must have thought he misheard. He asked her to repeat it. and Norma told a story that seemed impossible, that Mary Bell had strangled Brian Howe while Norma watched, unable to stop her, paralyzed by fear and confusion. That Mary had returned to the body later with scissors, that she had been curious about how the body looked, what changes death had made. It couldn't be true. Could it? An 11-year-old girl? A child barely out of primary school? But when detectives looked back at their notes, at the details they had gathered, a horrifying pattern emerged. The notes found after Martin Brown's death, Mary's behavior at the wake, the sightings of the two girls, and when they interviewed Mary Bell again, this time with the possibility that she might be involved, they saw what they had missed before. Mary Bell did not behave like an innocent child being questioned about a terrible crime. She behaved like someone playing a game, testing how much she could reveal, how much she could manipulate the conversation. She was calm, almost amused. When asked about Brian Howe, she provided details, small details that had not been publicly released, about the condition of his body. And when confronted more directly, when the detective suggested she might have been involved, Mary smiled. It was that smile that sealed it. Not evidence, not forensic proof, but the chilling realization that this child was different in a way that defied their understanding of children. She was, in that moment, showing them exactly who she was, and what they saw terrified them. The arrest of Mary Bell and Norma Bell sent shockwaves through Britain. Newspapers struggled with how to report it. The very concept of a child murderer, especially a girl, challenged every assumption about innocence, about childhood, about the nature of evil itself. The legal system was equally unprepared. British law had provisions for juvenile offenders, but those were designed for teenagers who committed theft or vandalism, not for pre-adolescent children accused of murder. How do you prosecute an 11-year-old? How do you even explain such charges to a child? The trial began in December 1968, 5 months after Brian Howe's death. The courtroom was packed with journalists, psychologists, and curious observers. Mary and Norma sat in the dock, two small figures in a room designed for adults. Mary wore a neat dress, her hair carefully combed. She looked around the courtroom with evident curiosity, as if this were an interesting school trip rather than a trial for murder. The prosecution's case was circumstantial but compelling. They presented evidence that both girls had been seen near the locations where the boys were killed. They presented Norma's statements, though she had recanted and changed her story multiple times. They presented the notes found after Martin's death. Most damning of all, they presented Mary's own statements to police, the small details she had known, the inadvertent admissions she had made. The defense faced an almost impossible task. Their client was 11 years old. How do you defend a child against murder charges when the evidence suggests guilt? Their strategy was to argue that Mary was too young to truly understand what she had done, that she suffered from psychological disturbances that prevented her from forming criminal intent. The trial became a referendum on childhood itself. Expert witnesses debated whether an 11-year-old could be truly evil or whether Mary was herself a victim of her abusive upbringing, of her mother's neglect, of neurological problems that prevented normal emotional development. Psychologists testified about Mary's complete lack of remorse, her apparent inability to empathize with others, her view of other people as objects to be manipulated or experimented upon. One psychologist described her as having a classic psychopathic personality, a diagnosis that was controversial then and remains controversial now. Can a child be a psychopath? Or is that diagnosis simply an adult framework being forced onto a developing mind? Norma Bell's trial proceeded alongside Mary's, but it quickly became clear that Norma was a very different case. She was frightened, confused, clearly troubled by what had happened. The evidence suggested she had been present during at least one of the murders, but had been dominated by Mary, unable to act independently. The jury would eventually acquit Norma, concluding that while she had witnessed terrible things, she had not been an active participant. But Mary Bell was another matter entirely. The testimony about her behavior was chilling. Witnesses described how she had returned to Brian Howe's body multiple times, curious about the stages of death and decomposition. How she had asked other children if they wanted to see where Brian was, as if showing off a discovery. How she had played games with younger children, where she would pretend to strangle them, laughing as they struggled. One particularly disturbing piece of evidence came from Mary's own notebook, found in her home. She had written stories, elaborate, violent stories about children being hurt, about death and suffering. The stories were written in a child's hand, with spelling errors and simple vocabulary, but the content was anything but childlike. The prosecution argued that these were not the products of a traumatized child acting out, but evidence of a mind that derives satisfaction from imagining and inflicting suffering. They painted a picture of a girl who was not insane in any legal sense. She understood right from wrong, understood what death meant, but who simply did not care, who found the suffering of others interesting rather than distressing. The jury deliberated for a day and a half. They found Mary Bell guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. She was not convicted of murder because the jury could not quite bring themselves to attach that label, with all its implications, to an 11-year-old girl. But make no mistake, they believed she had killed Martin Brown and Brian Howe. The judge, Justice Cusack, faced an unprecedented sentencing decision. Mary Bell was 11 years old. She could not be sent to adult prison. But she was dangerous. Everyone agreed on that. He sentenced her to be detained, at Her Majesty's pleasure, a British legal term meaning indefinitely, until she was deemed safe to release. As Mary was led from the courtroom, she showed no emotion. She looked around one more time, her intelligent eyes taking in the scene, and then she was gone. Mary Bell was taken to a secure facility for disturbed children, beginning a period of detention that would last 12 years. What happened during those years remains largely confidential, protected by British laws regarding juvenile offenders. We know she received extensive psychiatric treatment. We know that she gradually, slowly, began to show signs of developing the empathy and emotional connection to others that had been so notably absent during her trial. The question that haunted everyone who worked with her was whether this development was genuine change or merely the learned behavior of someone intelligent enough to understand what responses were expected. Can a psychopath be cured? Can someone who lacks empathy learn it, or only learn to simulate it? These questions remain unanswered even today. In 1980, at age 23, Mary Bell was released on license. She was given a new identity, a fresh start, a chance to live a life free from the notoriety of her past. The decision to release her was controversial and remains so. Some argued that 12 years was insufficient punishment for taking 2 innocent lives. Others argued that imprisoning a child for crimes committed at age 11 was itself a moral question with no clear answer. Mary Bell went on to have a child of her own. When this became publicly known, it sparked intense debate. Should someone convicted of killing children be allowed to raise children? But by all accounts, she was a devoted mother, protective to the point of fierceness, determined that her daughter would never know the horrors of Mary's own childhood. In 1998, 30 years after the murders, journalist Gitta Serini published a book based on extensive interviews with Mary Bell. The book, Cries Unheard, presented a portrait of a deeply damaged child who had been failed by every adult in her life. It detailed the abuse Mary had suffered, the sexual abuse, the physical violence, the psychological manipulation. It argued that Mary Bell was as much a victim as a perpetrator, a child who had never been given the tools to develop normally, who had learned violence and callousness as survival mechanisms. The book was met with outrage from the families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe. June Brown, Martin's mother, felt betrayed that Mary Bell was being presented sympathetically, that money was being made from her son's death. The debate raged in newspapers and on television. At what point do we separate the crime from the context? Can understanding lead to forgiveness? Should it? These questions remain unresolved. The case of Mary Bell has become a cornerstone study in criminal psychology, examined in every serious course on juvenile offenders and psychopathology. It raises questions we still struggle to answer. Are some people born evil, their brains wired differently from birth? Or are monsters made, shaped by abuse and neglect and circumstances beyond their control? If a child is a product of terrible abuse, at what point does she become responsible for perpetuating that cycle? Can childhood trauma excuse the inexcusable? Modern neuroscience has shown us that the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning, does not fully develop until the mid-20s. Children literally do not have fully formed capacity for judgment and consequences. Does this mean Mary Bell could not truly be held accountable? Or does the calculated nature of her crimes, the planning, the cover-ups, the manipulation, suggest a level of understanding that transcends normal development? The case also forced uncomfortable conversations about how society treats troubled children. Mary Bell had been seen by social services multiple times. Her teachers had noted behavioral problems. There had been incidents suggesting she was a danger to herself and others. But in the context of 1960s Britain, with limited resources and understanding of child psychology, the warning signs were missed or misinterpreted until it was too late. Today, a child like Mary Bell would likely be identified much earlier. We have better screening tools, more sophisticated understanding of psychological development, more resources for intervention. But even today, we struggle with how to help seriously disturbed children. The line between treatment and punishment, between protecting society and protecting the child, remains blurry. The families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe never truly recovered from their losses. How could they? Their children were taken from them in the most horrific way imaginable, and by someone so unexpected, a child, that it defied comprehension. June Brown spent the rest of her life haunted by the brief interaction she had with Mary at Martin's wake, by the feeling she had ignored, by the warning bells she had not recognized for what they were. In 2009, Mary Bell's identity was nearly exposed by the media, leading to a court ruling granting her lifelong anonymity. She continues to live under a protected identity somewhere in Britain, now in her 60s. She has never spoken publicly since the interviews with Gitta Sereni in the 1990s. Her daughter, now an adult herself, has also been granted anonymity. They live quiet lives, always looking over their shoulders, always aware that revelation would mean upheaval. The legacy of Mary Bell extends beyond the specifics of her case. She became a symbol, sometimes of evil, sometimes of victimhood, depending on who is telling the story. She represents our deepest fears about childhood, about the possibility that innocence is not inherent but learned, and that without the right circumstances, any child might become a monster. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Mary Bell case is this: there are no simple answers. She was both victim and perpetrator, both damaged child and dangerous killer. The truth is not binary but complex, messy, uncomfortable. Understanding her requires holding multiple contradictory truths simultaneously: that she did terrible things and that terrible things were done to her, that she should be held accountable, and that the adults who failed her should also bear responsibility, that she deserved punishment and that she deserved help. The children of Scotswood in 1968 were forever changed by that summer. Those who remember playing in the same streets as Mary Bell, who might have been her friends or victims, carry those memories into their own old age. They learned earlier than most that the world is not safe, that evil does not always look like we expect, that even children can harbor darkness. As for Mary Bell herself, we can only speculate about her internal life. Does she lie awake at night haunted by what she did? Has she truly changed? Or has she simply learned to hide better? Did treatment and time heal something broken in her? Or did they simply teach her to function despite it? We will likely never know. Some questions have no answers. Some mysteries remain unsolved not for lack of evidence, but because the human psyche is ultimately unknowable, even to itself. What we do know is this: on a spring day in 1968, in a working-class neighborhood in Newcastle, 2 small boys died at the hands of a child barely older than themselves. Their deaths shattered illusions about innocence and childhood. They forced questions we still haven't fully answered, and they left scars on families, on a community, on our collective understanding of human nature that will never fully heal. The case of Mary Bell stands as a dark mirror, reflecting back truths we would rather not face about childhood, violence, responsibility, and the very nature of evil. It reminds us that the monsters in our midst do not always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive quietly, with a child's face and a child's voice, and by the time we recognize them for what they are, it is already too late. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying truth of all.